Hi, I'm Othais, and this is a Mauser 1893, and no, this is not a rerun episode. This is a Spanish Mauser 1893. Let's go ahead and get into the light box. With an overall length of 48 1/2 inch and weighing in at 8.8 pounds, this is an old school infantry rifle, but still fairly modern because we have a 5-round flush fit staggered box magazine feeding from a stripper clip, taking the 7x57mm Mauser cartridge.
Hey viewers, don't forget if you're enjoying the content, feel free to like, comment, or, well, make certain you are subscribed. Recently, YouTube decided to release roughly 10,000 subscribers, including my own moderator account. So just double check. Also, if you'd like to directly support us, please consider joining us on Patreon, Subscribestar, or Utreon. Or check out our shop at C&Rsenal.com/shop. Thank you all.
Now, technically, our gun today was covered in a fair bit of detail on this series before. That's because this same pattern of rifle would be sold to the Ottoman Empire, although in their case it was fitted with a magazine disconnect. In that episode, we did give a very rushed rundown of the Spanish adoption of the 1893 Mauser, and we did a fair job of covering the mechanical evolution. For today's episode, we'll revisit both of those in better detail with a clear emphasis on why and how, specifically, Spain adopted this rifle. So let's get into it, starting with the Spanish rolling block. Adopted in 1871, this breech-loading, single-shot, black powder rifle had been adopted at what would come to be the latter years of the Spanish Empire. Once massive in scale, Spain's influence had been worn down largely by Napoleonic-era warfare and political fallout. Now, for 1871, the rolling block was a fine choice, but as we know from our show, by the middle 1880s, most major powers were moving into magazine-repeating rifles of some sort. Some were even adopting small-bore cartridges capable of moving faster and being held together by jacketed bullets. In 1886, the French would be the first to adopt smokeless powder. And that same year, the Austrians introduced a clip-loading Mannlicher rifle. Soon, smokeless small-bore repeaters with rapid loading options became the standard for infantry armament. An arms race was on, and despite being a major player, Spain was falling rapidly behind. France had started things rolling, and from our Mauser perspective, the Ottomans didn't have time to change course, so they instead adopted what was going to be a revolutionary small-bore black powder rifle. Germany managed to adapt quickly, releasing their Gewehr 1888, which used the Mannlicher's clips and had a number of faults. The adoption of this rifle would also insult a certain inventor into decisive action. Paul Mauser, frequently featured on our show, had been the originator of Germany's previous two black powder rifles, and he had had a much better idea of how to design a smokeless rifle than the Gewehr 88. The first Mauser rifle adopted in the smokeless era would become the Belgian Model 1889, and after dropping the barrel jacket would be worked into the Ottoman Model 1890. Now, Spanish authorities had been watching the market all through the 1880s. The development of smokeless powder, however, had them actually begin seriously testing rifles. They did not want to be outranged. Now, most of the commercially available first wave of smokeless guns were really just modified black powder rifles that did not take full advantage of the new technology. But with the development of that Mauser 1889, Spain was suddenly much more focused and curious. They would put in sample orders for a handful, which sparked even more interest and eventually full orders. 1,000 rifles based on the Ottoman 1890 pattern with some changes that would be shared by the later Argentine 1891. All these rifles, by the way, were in the 7.65 Mauser cartridge first adopted in Belgium, but popularly known as 7.65 Argentine in the US, thanks to our familiarity with those rifles in the surplus market. This was Mauser's original smokeless cartridge, which Belgium fitted for a Malicore jacket, and Spain took in a cupro-nickel cladding. Now, for most of the features of the new Spanish 1891, you can really just review our episode on the Ottoman 1890, except when it comes to extraction. That's because Paul Mauser was taking careful note of issues that were arising in Germany with the Gewehr 1888, and technically with his own design as well in Belgium and in Constantinople. Let's take a look at what that was. To demonstrate, I have our Ottoman 1890 here, and I've gone ahead and loaded it with a handful of snap caps. Now, what we're concerned about is the control of this feeding cartridge, how much we can influence it with the bolt. So if I start to feed the round, you'll see that as we get close to releasing from the magazine, we still haven't actually snagged it with the bolt. As a matter of fact, if I go forward and even most of the way into the battery, but don't turn the bolt handle down, when I retract this bolt, we still have not actually lipped the extractor over top of the rim of the cartridge, which means if I pull this back, we'll see that we still have one in the chamber. You can see from this other camera angle. And if I start to feed the next cartridge, it's just gonna drive that bullet tip, in this case, just below the primer, but boy, if you were in a hurry and not paying attention, you could actually go tip to primer. And in rare cases, you may end up with an out of battery detonation. This was especially bad for the Gewehr 88. In an attempt to correct his issue, Mauser began, well, originally over-engineering it. By the time of the Spanish 1891, this had evolved into a set of grooves on either side of the bolt face, which would grab the cartridge right away. However, without any spring tension. Then, as the cartridge rose during the feeding process, it would snap past this spring detent, which then kept it biased to the extractor, meaning it could not interfere with the next cartridge to feed. This proved troublesome and inefficient in actuality. The new rifle was issued to the Cebolla No. 6 Infantry Regiment and the No. 19 Battalion of Cazadores de Puerto Rico. In a month-long trial, they expended some 500,000 rounds of ammunition. This appears to have been done just over December and January of 1891-1892. Further experiments carried on into April, and requests for changes were made. Paul Mauser himself would travel to Madrid in July of 1892 with samples of a new rifle and carbine to meet Spanish expectations. Just to be clear, at this same time, Sweden was also trialing the Mauser inventions, and they too are requesting changes. So it will ultimately be requests from both Spain and from Sweden that would add into what becomes our design today. If you'd like to know more about the Swedish decisions, well, we have an episode for that already. Their final rifle is actually pretty cool. So what about the Spanish 1891 didn't work? What was changed? Well, sadly, I don't have the next gun in the lineage here to be able to show you because it would prove to be very short-lived. I'm of course referring to the elusive Spanish Model 1892, named as such because it was adopted in November of, you'll never guess this, 1892. Now, thankfully for our story today, almost all of the major features of the 1892 were passed along into the bolt, not the rest of the gun, but the bolt of the Mauser 1893. And the magazine components, not so much. So I can borrow from a more modern rifle to show you the key details. Here I have an Ottoman 1890 bolt from the rifle we saw before. This is actually the same pattern you'll see in the early Argentine 1891s, although they would get a little update in Argentina, so that's why I selected this guy. This is actually out of our 1893 already. I know it's skipping ahead just a bit, but the features that are in this bolt should be mostly accounted for by the 1892 model, excepting one little difference that I'll point out. So what have we developed here? Well, in the 1890, we have this overhead extractor. It's a very simple affair that simply grabs the cartridge when it's at its uppermost position and then snapped over at the chambering moment. So not what you would call a controlled feed. It doesn't retain the cartridge at any point before actually fully into battery. Now, this guy has a full-length, very flexible, adaptable extractor. The reason for all this, by the way, is to spread that spring tension out over a longer surface, and therefore get a lot more longevity. Also, this is a non-rotating extractor. It doesn't rotate with the bolt. That allows it to stay secured in place on the cartridge. If we look at the face, we'll see we have a lot of support room, and it picks up very early. Look at that. Right there at the, yep, right there, we've already got a little hook, and then it just gets stronger as we go further up. This is the kind of gun that's going to have a controlled feed. It's going to pick it up early and hold on to it right up until it is chambered. There's no snap over happening here either, unless you force one in the chamber and then bolt close, which it's capable of flexing out of the way for. It's beveled for it, But generally, we're not doing a lot of damage to that extractor, so it's very rare to see one of these broken, when it's very common to see others broken. Now, ignore the square on the bottom of this. We'll talk about that in a moment. On the 1892, that would have been round. If we look at the cocking pieces, they're very similar. We're nowhere near the later Mauser 98's giant, gas shield, but we have developed the precursor for it, which is this nubbin right here, this extension. What this does is when the bolt is in the actual rifle, this covers up the raceway. Remember, there's a set of raceways that allow this lug and extractor to fit through them. And then if we fire and there's a case head separation or other rupture, you may have gas leak down the raceways. Well, they're going to get into the shooter's face because the locking lugs will have been turned. And therefore the lugs will not be blocking those raceways. It'll come down and it'll get stopped by one of these little wing-a-dings. Now, these were actually added later on to the Argentine rifles in Argentina, which is why I kind of need this Ottoman 1890 to show you, because it's a little uncommon to find them on the Argentinian guns. But look at that. Perfectly smooth, and therefore not as likely to defend your precious eyes from a gas leak. While I'm in this position, I want you to see the safety. This is a 2-position flag safety from the Ottoman 1890, and you can see we have a screw here. What's underneath that is a spring and a detent/plunger, which allows this to bias into one of its 2 positions. Now, this is where our new 1893 deviates from what would have been the design that's in between these two, because the design in between these two would have still had the detent, it would have still had this screw. This does not. We'll see what this was replaced with in a moment. And at the same time, it would have had a 3rd position. Let me explain those positions to you. On our Ottoman rifle, these are the 2 positions. Fire, where we can discharge the rifle, or safe, in which we cannot. At no point in the safe process, even in this middle position, can we open up the action. We have to be on fire in order to withdraw the bolt. Now again, we're using an 1893 as a stand-in for the 1892. I'm sorry I don't have one. We would have had 3 detent positions. In this case, this has been totally redesigned at the back. Don't worry about that. All you care about right now are the positions. On the 1892, we go from having a fire and safe position to also having a 3rd vertical position in which the bolt can be retracted. What that middle position has done for us is it's held the cocking piece to the rear, whereas the previous design we'd have had to pull back on this. And with it rearward, we're able to do a little magic. We can just go ahead and unscrew our firing pin assembly from the bolt body. Now, this feature was already in the 1892, and another feature that was already in that gun is the perfectly always set firing pin position. Because on the earlier guns, they would have been threaded in, and in this case, we have an interrupted lug pattern. Let me show you that. Previously, we'd have to depress this cocking shroud, and then start rotating this guy like a screw. But in this case, we now just have to turn him 90 degrees, and then we're out. So ignoring the other components for a moment, that means that once we have set our depth to a fixed point and turn 90 degrees, our firing pin is set in relation to the cocking piece. That means that since the sear engages right here on this lip, that this distance is always set correctly, that distance between these 2 points. So that means you're not going to end up in a situation where this is overset and therefore poking a primer too soon, or underset and therefore not striking a primer when you intend to fire the gun. This is a critically important little advancement that really makes sure that this is idiot-proof. The final advancement of the 1892 bolt, which carried on into the 1893 we have here, is this groove right here. This is a safety notch for the front of the sear assembly for the trigger. So you'll see this better in an animation in a moment, but the short answer is if this gun is anywhere out of battery, as in if this is not perfectly aligned with what would be the poker for the sear, so if we're here, it can't poke, then the gun can't fire. The trigger cannot be dropped far enough to release the sear. Once it's aligned perfectly, it can poke in there and the sear can be released. That makes this a very effective and simple out-of-battery safety. Other features of the 1892 include its integrated single-stack magazine, which could be dismantled with the rim of a cartridge case. This, however, would not be carried forward. Another important feature of the 1892 rifle, not this one, was the introduction on that platform of the 7mm Mauser cartridge. Paul Mauser himself pushed Spain hard to abandon his own 7.65mm cartridge because he was particularly proud of the performance of his new 7mm, and to my eye, he was right. Flat shooting, hard hitting, and not too terribly severe on recoil while still preserving a nice sectional density. It's a good cartridge. Now, if you really want a tour of one of these rare 1892 Mausers, our friend Ian over at Forgotten Weapons has managed to spend some time with one, so give that video a look. With the rifle matter at that time settled for the Spanish Army, the Navy would now have a go at it, ordering 400 Trials 1892 carbines, which would be tested and approved ahead of orders for their production. These would prove to be just about all they got, however. Despite the adoption of the new gun, the matter of an actual contract dragged on. Negotiations and decisions carried into July of 1893. This probably had a bit to do with the finalizing of tests for the new 7mm Mauser cartridge. That was a little bit of a late addition. I've read it was introduced just 2 months ahead of adoption. In addition, the massive price tag of not just the new rifle, but also the ability to produce it at home invited a lot of skepticism, and the French-friendly Republican press of the day latched onto whatever they could to discourage the German-Spanish relationship. And as you may recall from our Gewehr 1888 episode, the fact that Mauser was overseen by Ludwig Olson at the time would create a sort of anti-Semitic scandal that ultimately saw the company change names later on. Still, the Spanish government knew the Mauser was the superior product compared to the competition, and the delay was tolerable, as the Navy was just now getting their sample carbines anyway. Finally, numbers were made up and finalized in the summer, and even expanded in August for how many guns they would want. But before production could get really rolling, or any deliveries could be made, disaster struck for the model 1892. Someone had actually invented a better rifle and submitted that design to Spain ahead of production. That man? Paul Mauser. How dare he? Yep, Mauser sabotaged his own project with the Spanish by introducing them to his improved rifle, one that had been developed further by interest from Sweden. The major changes were in the magazine and would result in Spain immediately abandoning the 1892. On December 7th, 1893, they would officially adopt the new rifle, the, you'll never guess this, Model 1893, this guy. With a scant few hundred models 1892 actually produced, the entire contract was swapped onto the new rifle and expanded. More on those numbers in a moment. So, what exactly did the Spanish adopt? Well, this, of course, so let's go ahead and get a closer look at it. So, we have a long rifle. Whew. Okay, let's start at the rear. Steel butt plate with, ooh, that's a deep tang on there. And then we've got a lower rear swivel, no semi-pistol grip, that's a straight wrist stock. There's our comb. Let's come forward, trigger flush magazine, obviously turn bolt operation. We'll talk about the action more in a moment. Skip those sights as we wander back up to our half-length upper handguard, mid-position band. And then we come on up to our, a dovetailed front sight, a slight reduction in the muzzle ring in order to fit the bayonet that goes with this lug. As a matter of fact, the first bayonet for the Spanish 1893 was roughly based on the German 7184, so a single-edged knife pattern of relatively short length. This was developed back with the 1892 rifle. Produced by Simpson and Company in Germany and at home in Toledo, there are slight differences between the manufacturers. In 1895, the Manila Artillery Arsenal was authorized to purchase a longer pattern of bayonet based on the Argentine 1891. These rare examples were used primarily in the Philippines, and it appears some may have been in Cuba. Now, looking at our rear sight, this is actually an updated pattern. The originals, coming from Ludwig Olson and others in Germany, would look like this. This is actually an 1895 Mauser. Although the original wasn't a 2-button setup, it was actually
like this with one on the right side. Oviedo would simplify the components and move the button to the left side, likely in order to allow the left-hand thumb to operate the rear sight more effectively.
Once again, returning to our Ottoman for comparison, the old style of stripper clip was such that it was flat-sided and held in place by the spring tension from the bolt stop. So this overarching piece is doing the job of pinching the stripper clip to try to retain it. This proved to be not entirely satisfactory. Mauser's improved clip used a set of raised nubs on the outside edge. These helped anchor them into the gun, which had corresponding grooves. So here's our nubbins on the new clip, and if we look overhead, we have corresponding little round grooves cut, and these actually have a slight taper to them. So when we insert this guy, those nubs bite down into the grooves, and the harder that these are to feed, the more pressure we have to put in, the more firmly our clip's going to bite into the receiver, and the more stable it's going to get. So in other words, the more difficult it is to strip, the more this anchors into place until all the rounds are in. And then it's just sort of riding on top. There's not a lot of tension, and so you can throw your bolt forward, it'll pop that guy right out of the way, and then you're on to feeding your cartridges. That is a handy system. I should probably finally talk about this action, which honestly, it's such a good design that it set the mold. And when you set the mold, you kind of become taken for granted. You become boring because everything looks like you. But this was innovative at its time. So let's take a look at what we got. First of all, it's a rotating bolt cock on close, which means that as I bring this bolt forward, we're going to see that our currently depressed cocking piece is going to come popping on out. That's the full cock. And then if we fire the rifle, we'll see it drop. Boom. Now, pay attention, because just because it's cock on close doesn't mean that there's zero camming happen. If I start to open this, you're going to see it come out just a little bit. That little bit is enough to retract the firing pin off the face of the bolt, and that's critical because when we go to feed the next round, we don't want a little bit of firing pin poking out, maybe indenting the primer as we close it and not quite in battery. So there is just a little bit of camming happening, but well more than 95% of it is right here on that closing stroke. Some people prefer cock on close, saying it's faster. Some say that it throws off your aim as you're closing up the bolt. That is an argument for the ages. Now, if you want to take the bolt out of the gun, you use this bolt release, which is also our bolt stop. It's actually spring tensioned, and it rides along the left side of the bolt and strikes down on the left side lug when we're all the way to the rear. When we're cycling the gun, if we run out of ammunition, the gun tells us that we are out. This was a known issue at the time, that you may have infantry in the heat of battle get excited and just start chambering on empty and pulling the trigger, and it goes click. And they don't even know that it went click because maybe they heard a bang from the guy next to them. They're just delirious with battle stress. And so this prevents you from making that mistake. It tells you you must reload your gun if you'd like to continue. It's a very good feature. Looking at the magazine itself, this is a double stack. So let's see, I'll load this guy. Ooh, there we go, off to the right, and then off to the left, back and forth until we have 5. Double stack, flush magazine. This was new to this rifle. This is actually the biggest innovation of this particular design over the 1892, and it's the #1 reason it was selected. That flush fit magazine, by the way. Now, by design, this guy has a releasable floor plate, which uses a hook at the front and a plunger and spring at the rear. You're supposed to take the tip of an unfired bullet and shove it in there, and then you're supposed to just take your palm and drag this guy rearward. That never seems to work out when the gun's 100-odd years old, so I tend to have to hold that in firmly and then take something like a soft rubber mallet and just give it a good bap. There we go. That's a little bit easier than fighting it. At that point, you can release the contents of the magazine, clean and inspect, and then reinsertion is again just hooking it at the front and then pushing forward, which again, this guy is very stiff, so I tend to have to get out the mallet in order to reassemble as well. Be careful not to have this situation in which we have not seen the plunger actually click in place. That is a potential problem because you're going to fire and then this guy's just going to go bop, and you're going to be surprised when everything falls out of the gun. It's kind of hard to make out, but there is a ridge in here. That's a little solid piece that splits the left side locking lug on the bolt and therefore provides a certain amount of rigidity as we have basically half of the locking system clearing this big opening in the receiver. The idea is that this doesn't get too rattly because if you let it get too loose, you can actually bind up the action by over torquing on it while closing it. So that's a little advantage for smoothing out the feed that we'll see changed over to a different system in the later 98 rifles. Returning to the bolt face, I wanted to explain this square bottom. Usually these would have been round, but because this was the first gun to feature the double stack magazine, they became concerned that there would be some difficulty in picking up the offset rounds, one offset to the left and one offset to the right, or vice versa. This design was meant to give the maximum amount of contact without interrupting the feed of the mechanism. It proved to be unnecessary, and so we see like the later 1895 Mausers get rid of this right away. Turning to the safety, we saw it briefly earlier, and I already told you that it's now a 3-position safety and what that meant for the gun. That of course came from the 1892. But what's new to this gun is the fact that it no longer used a spring and plunger set in through the actual flag. Instead, it's given up the spring entirely in order to use actually the firing pin spring on through the cocking piece in order to get a little pressure on the safety. And it's done this in a very ingenious way. This is a rotating wedge that cams over and pushes back our cocking piece and blocks it from being able to fire. That much we've seen before in Mausers. But what these embossings do, these little circular cuts right here, is it means that for a brief moment when we're rotating this, we've overcammed our cocking piece back a little bit further than usual, and then as it gets to that notch, that little less than a millimeter deep notch, it snaps in. And then that provides resistance. It means that we must overcome in order to go to the next setting. And therefore we're getting our detent position by a simple embossing on the back of this particular wedge, which eliminates, I think, like 3 parts. That's really good. I think I've covered this guy fairly well, but as we know, our animator Bruno can always do it just a little bit better. Cheater. So let's go ahead and get a closer look with his help.
First, we load up the rifle with the improved stripper clip, which double stacks 5 rounds into the flush fit magazine. Note the long, non-rotating extractor. As we feed the first round, its rim is quickly slid up under the extractor lip, providing a controlled feed and preventing unnecessary snap over. As we withdraw the bolt, the extractor brings the spent case along, driving it into the spring-loaded ejector, which flicks it from the action. Here is the firing pin, which is constantly pressed forward by a coil spring. The firing pin is held rearward by the cocking piece. The cocking piece is held rearward by the sear. Pulling the trigger tips the sear and releases the cocking piece, firing the rifle. As we raise the bolt, the cocking piece is cammed slightly rearward. This is just enough to retract the firing pin. Otherwise, the bolt remains decocked until bolted back forwards when the cocking piece snags on the sear, making this a cock on close action. The 1893 uses an improved flag safety. Rotating the safety drives a circular wedge against the cocking piece, camming it slightly back and preventing it from traveling forward. At the same time, a quartered projection at the front of the safety turns into a notch on the bolt body, preventing the bolt from being rotated open. This projection off the sear is the out-of-battery safety. Because the sear is a tipping block, this tip must be able to rise in order for the rear to fall. It can only do so, however, when a small notch in the bolt body is aligned, which means it isn't possible to fire the rifle out of battery. By the way, the trigger on this rifle is a 2-stage design, meaning it first flattens out at the top, and then as you pull over the rear hump, the sear is dropped enough to fire. Finally, the follower, powered by a simple folded flat spring, rises to block the path of the bolt indicating that the magazine is empty. Now let's go shoot it.
You know, I am a big fan of the 7mm cartridge. Now, the adoption of the Mauser Model 1893 should have been a massive payday for the factory at Oberndorf. However, when the request finally came through, they were still working on the last bits of an Ottoman order, and the Ottomans had a stipulation in their contracts that no other country's orders could be filled until theirs were delivered. So production of the new rifle had to go up the ladder. Recall, if you will, Paul Mauser's own company had been the victim of a hostile takeover by Ludwig Löwe, now headed by the surviving brother Isidor. Being part of a consortium with Mauser work busy, Löwe would handle things directly. Now, the first Spanish contract was a carryover from the 1892 rifle. In other words, the same numbers were kept and just transposed from the 1892 for the 1893. Just cross out one little number and write it in with a red pen, I guess. So the initial request was for 70,000 rifles and 5,000 carbines. This was just the start, though. The contracted amount would eventually rise to 221,800 rifles and 27,500 carbines. We'll actually talk about those next episode. And now I get to point out that from the very moment the first order for the Model 1893 was let out, it was already too late, because Spain had found itself in conflict. This would be the first Melian campaign, a series of battles between Spain and the 39 tribes of the Rif, a region in northern Morocco. In a nutshell, Spain had been expanding economic and political influence in Morocco, but the people of the Rift were prone to banditry and independence, and were exceedingly hard to influence. After a series of smaller incidents, Spain began a program of expanding its military presence in the region, and this eventually led to more armed conflict with the locals. The most notable of which being on October 3rd, when 6,000 Rif warriors attacked Melillas's garrison of only 400 regular infantry. During the defense of Melilla, the Spanish used artillery to fire on gathering bands of fresh Rif warriors and managed to smash a mosque in the process. This did not help settle things down at all. This escalated quite noticeably, actually, which meant Spain needed to send more troops, and with them, rifles. Now, I've heard people say the siege of Melilla in 1893 was the first use of Spain's new 1893 Mauser, but at best they might have had the 1891 Trials gun, or one of the handful of 1892s that were produced, but neither of those is actually particularly likely either. They were probably still largely doing their jobs with the old Remington single shot. The Spanish army wasn't particularly happy going into battle with just the single loader, and especially the old black powder cartridge, so they would reach out for international help, and through a series of fast negotiations, which we'll actually cover another day on that rifle, they managed to purchase 10,000 Argentine Mausers. These were still in 7.65mm, a cartridge Spain already had from the trials, and turned up with a mixture of Argentine, Spanish, and even no markings at all, apparently. Also, it seems they managed 5,000 carbines. While the conflict would finally settle into a Spanish victory in April of 1894, it underscores the need for more military modernization, likely driving the expansion of those contract numbers that we saw earlier. Löwe was also probably moving too slow for Spanish rearmament, and so another contract would be let out in November of 1895. 30,000 additional rifles would be ordered from Mauser Obendorf, which had just recently gotten through the Ottoman order for that same rifle. These and the Lova production would be finished by August of 1896. By the way, this also included some 18 million cartridges. Now these numbers may seem huge, especially for purchasing from a foreign power. Usually it's a little smaller when we do this, but Spain was still a player on the world stage, which meant that Spanish officials were wary of being dependent on that foreign manufacturer. Again, you don't see those big numbers from foreign purchases usually. From the very first contract, they had negotiated at great expense the right to produce the Mauser at home in Oviedo. Specifically, Fábrica de Armas Oviedo, which had been built in a former convent back in 1856. Further expanded, it produced Marshall firearms for Spain, notably the Le Fachot revolver and that Remington rolling block rifle we've been talking about. Oviedo underwent further upgrades, including a central power plant, in order to manufacture the machinery-dependent Mauser bolt-action repeating rifles. The barrels would be sourced from the nearby Trubia steel plant, and bayonets, like we said before, were coming from Toledo. Manufacture of the Mauser 1893 at Oviedo seems to have begun in 1895, although this was likely only a handful of test pieces. And the Spanish factory did make some slight changes. As I showed you before, the rear sight was altered slightly, and they found the German bluing was wearing too fast, so Spanish-made guns are usually thickly blued, jet black dark, almost like paint. Serial production got underway in 1896, however it appears this was still limited, and it would take until 1898 for a solid production of over 10,000 pieces a year to truly get rolling. Eventually, this would rise as high as 30,000 units a year, and while I'm unsure of how long they paid the license fee, the original contract back in December of 1893 would pay Mauser work 2 marks per each rifle, so it could have been a good payday. Of course, those of you who know your history will know that 1898 full production date is just coming a little bit too late, because back in 1895, Spain had already begun fighting an insurgent force in Cuba, and they had already been policing their territories in the Philippines. And with Cuban unrest, the Far East theater kindled back up as well. And now Spain was fighting in 2 of its colonies and expending more men and material than in the Rif. This again created more demand for rifles, so yet another contract was let out, this time to Fabrique Nationale in Belgium. It's estimated just 14,000 rifles and carbines, we're uncertain of how many of each, would be produced by FN. Just a reminder, FN was also a subsidiary of Ludwig Lova, which in 1897 changed names in order to rebrand following the Gewehr 1888 scandal. Spain would contract with the newly formed DWM for 40,000 more 1893 rifles, many of which were marked for naval adoption. You can actually spot one of these by the scripted MA ahead of the serial number. Neat. Now, without going into too much detail, the economic instability brought on by the prosecution of the Cuban War caused the United States of America to become more and more involved in that conflict. A sort of feedback loop began. The US voiced concerns for want of stability regardless of the winner. Reporting on this topic inevitably reminded US citizens of their own war for independence, and soon the public were sympathetic to Cuban freedom. And US foreign policy began to follow along with public opinion, and soon intervention was almost inevitable. But the final straw on the camel's back is still a controversy today. Thanks to a riot in Cuba in January of 1898, concerns for US citizens in the area prompted a response. The USS Maine was sent to Havana, attempting to clearly show the US interest in resolving the conflict and hoping to calm matters down. The complete opposite effect would be achieved when the Maine suddenly exploded on the night of February 15th, 1898. To this day, people still debate whether this was an accident, sabotage, or a direct mine attack. Regardless, it prompted overwhelming support for US direct intervention, which in turn produced the Spanish-American War, fought in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. While this would result in US victory, the Spanish humiliation had more to do with vessels, manpower, and tactics than it had to do with their rifle. That's because this, the Mauser 1893, proved to be just about the most hellish thing the Americans would encounter in that conflict. At the time, the official rifle of the United States was the Krag-Jorgensen, which was a magazine-loading, small-bore, smokeless powder repeating rifle. But it was still a little sluggish, had no rapid loading clip system, and most importantly, was in shorter supply than you'd think. Long, long ago, the US maintained a very small standing army, and the Krag was still fairly new and in active production, and they actually kept changing things on it. Various secondary units, the sort of guardsmen or even volunteers that were called up in times of war, well, they mostly still had the old single-shot trapdoor rifles. These were large-bore, black powder, single-shot designs, and fairly slow ones at that. Pitted against the Mauser, they weren't very confidence-inspiring. The following is a selection from The Fall of Santiago by Thomas J. Vivian. For the first time, our surgeons were able to make close study of what a Mauser rifle shot wound was like. All that need be said here is that the dead and wounded showed that the Mauser bullet, when received at close range, makes, at its point of entrance, only a small hole, but at its point of exit, it seems to take everything with it. Those killed at Guantanamo and struck in the head would have been scarcely more shattered had they stood in the path of a shell. Ouch. Viewers of our show know that American experience with the Mauser was enough to shake off any loyalty to Krag Jorgensen and began a program to replace the still very new rifles. And they had plenty of guns to study, capturing 23,892 rifles and 1,247 carbines of all types at Santiago alone. Now, these weren't necessarily just 1893s, as rolling blocks and even the old 1891s were still mixed in, albeit to a lesser degree. The result of US research and testing would be the Springfield 1903 rifle, which in turn was worked into something we're more familiar with in 1906, especially in our usual World War I context. Definitely not a Mauser though, right? Nope, just based on one, sort of. Returning to the Spanish Mauser, however, I still need to talk about Oviedo some more. In time, the factory would produce over 500,000 rifles, although this does include carbines, various carbines actually, and the production ranged into the 1930s, so I apologize for not being able to break this number down further. Oviedo did get involved in 2 export contracts, but only one of which was for the Mauser 1893. The Mexican model 1895 rifle and carbine, both in 7mm Mauser. There's a little story to that carbine, by the way. But that's for our next episode, which is when I'll break down the development and use of Spanish 1893 derived carbines and musketons, along with a further tidbit on the long rifle, at least its updates after the Spanish-American War. But before all that, let's get Mae in for a chat about what it's like to use this long rifle. Alright gang, once more we've made room for Mae, and we have just enough room for another long rifle, this time the Spanish 1893.
Yep.
And you may hear some rumbling. That is not my tummy. That is the sound of thunder, which we usually try to avoid for this show. However, we're on week 3 of constant thunderstorms in our area, so we're 3 days behind on filming as it is. We've got to make this work, so pardon any external noise.
Please and thank you.
All right, so let's get a tour of this rifle ergonomically, because I have a feeling this is going to be pretty familiar to those of you who have watched other episodes of ours.
Yep, all right, so feels pretty infantry standard rifle length. We've got, 49 inches there is what I'm thinking of, it feels like. Weight, balance isn't too bad for the weight where it's at. It looks like I'm right here set behind the rear sight, so that's not too bad for my left hand. Everything about this, by the way, just generic look-wise, this is just screaming of Mauser action to me. Nothing on here looks unfamiliar or like it doesn't suit that.
Yeah, this is a quintessential Mauser for a lot of people. There's actually an argument that Mauser should have stopped here and not gone on to the 1898, that the 1898 was designed specific for German interests. But we'll talk more about that in a second.
Sure. The action itself, well, I don't have any rounds in there, so of course it's going to stop it with follower. Very smooth though. Cock on close. Yep, cock on close action. Everything about that feels pretty clean up in there. Nothing really feels gritty about it, which is nice. Standard Mauser flag safety. Nothing unremarkable there either. I like the checkering that they've included on that. That feels pretty good. Comb height was decent. Straight wrists, unfortunately, but you know, not too terrible to deal with.
Perfectly normal for the time as well.
Yeah, nothing super unremarkable. Love that there's a handguard here. Definitely helps out. And they even tried to lighten the weight by not extending it all the way, which is pretty good. That bayonet lug, I wonder if that's pretty solid as is up here for the size of that.
Yeah, we didn't talk about this on the last time because we shot the Ottoman 1893, which is the same gun with a magazine cutoff.
Yeah.
Which is really weird, actually. We kind of went in the most bizarre order possible because most people have seen a Spanish 1893 and almost no one's seen an Ottoman in person.
It was just a matter of sometimes for the show we have to go out of order effectively. There's no way to do all of this in order. That would be impossible.
Well, it's also that we primarily had the war focus, and now we're moving into neutral. So, what we didn't talk about at that time, which really stood out to the Germans going over to the Gewehr 98 from this gun, is the bayonet lug is technically pretty weak on these guys. It's retained by a single hook that's part of a spring clip on the barrel band retention clip. So, if you think about it, you beat that up a good bit, and next thing you know, it's flying off. You see this in arisakas. A lot of people that have like Japanese rifles will notice that they start to lose the front end band because it's the spring's slack, the clip's chipped off, whatever the case may be.
Well, I noticed it was in between when we were getting started that the barrel band at the very top, this one, including the bayonet lug, is actually a little bit wobbly. It's not like perfectly fit, but I did notice it had a little bit of shift to it.
Yeah, the way it's designed, the clearing rod, I should say, actually keeps pressure on it so that you have to take out the clearing rod, then you can depress the spring, then you can take off the band. But regardless of all that, it still is only a very small surface area holding on that band. And so that becomes a problem over time. You'll see a lot of them damaged nowadays. So that's probably the one critical weak point, which is that the whole reason this is such a long rifle is because it's meant to be used as a pike, essentially, whenever you have the bayonet fitted.
I could see that.
There's also some feelings about accuracy at that time and needing a longer barrel that then were dismissed later on, and most people went to universal short rifles and saw almost no difference in performance. But there's a very solid reason for this to have some length as an infantry rifle, and then you kind of don't get all that benefit by having a weak bayonet attachment point. And the whole reason it's not just mounted straight to the barrel, again, goes back to the idea of trying to keep your bayonet roughly disconnected, although it still has a muzzle ring in this design. But the more you can keep the bayonet disconnected from the barrel, the less you affect your precision whenever you change over to having the bayonet mounted versus unmounted when shooting. So that's sort of the 1893, 1895s. I feel like the bayonet is sort of the weak point to me.
I mean, that's fair. I could see that. Like I said, this one in particular, I don't know how much wear it's had on it, and it's already kind of wobbling a little bit. So,
right.
And I know we haven't attached, but we haven't played with it. So,
now overall, this gun is in very nice shape. It's still matched. Most Spanish Mausers that you find in the collector's market are mismatches. They're beat up. You know, this one is very clean.
The wood looks clean, the metal looks clean, and the rifling's actually pretty solid. So nothing about it really looks very worn.
And I believe this is a 1915 chamber date?
Yep, Oviedo.
Yep. So Spanish made 1915 in excellent condition. Still not what you'd call a very expensive gun in the modern collector's market, which is very interesting because let's talk about your experiences some more. What's it like actually shouldering and firing this gun?
So I had to think about it for a moment because it not just that there's been a lot of time between now and when I shot this piece, but I remember the shoot with this one kind of being unremarkable, and not in a bad way. It was actually interesting that I found it unremarkable because it did so well. Nothing about it was super bizarre for loading, for shooting down range, for getting my shots on target where I wanted to be at. They actually landed pretty well. You know, the sights are very fine, good for long range. I mean, they could stand to be a little deeper for rapid acquisition, but they're okay. They're good for the long range distance that I was shooting at and for the conditions I was shooting in. The trigger itself, very smooth two-stage. The first take-up bit was very light, maybe like a pound of weight with it, and then there was a break, and you could not feel when that break was about to happen right after that cliff. It was very nice. Recoil, there really wasn't much recoil to this guy. I was expecting more, but 7x57, it was pretty decent out of this gun.
Yeah, I actually really prefer that cartridge, if we can talk about that for a second.
Did I light on something for you?
Well, one of your top, I think your personal top gun from our top 10 World War I rifle segments was...
technically the RSC, but you know.
Was it? Oh, yeah. No, but one of your top ones was the Serbian in 7x57.
Oh, yeah, that was beautiful.
And every time we've laid hands on a bolt action 7x57, it's inspired a lot of confidence because and I want to talk about this for a second. Swedish Mauser, 6.5.
Okay.
Lovely cartridge.
Sure.
Japanese 6.5, lovely cartridge.
Oh, yeah.
These cartridges, though, were designed in the non-Spitzer era. So technically, where we went to in this episode, stopping in 1898, this was still a bottlenose cartridge. We haven't talked about Spitzer yet, but that's what we shot out of it because this one's cited for Spitzer.
Right.
So a bottlenose 6.5, a lot of countries were really slow to switch them over to Spitzer because they're so small that you lose a lot of sectional density. You lose a lot of mass, right? Mm-hmm. And you get a little extra flat shooting and longer range.
Right.
But it being a 6.5, it's already pretty flat shooting and long ranged. Mm-hmm. And you essentially going from a bottlenose 6.5 to a Spitzer 6.5 doesn't get you as much yield as going from a bottlenosed 8mm to a Spitzer 8mm did, or like with 30-06 or something like that, which was a Spitzer cartridge, almost immediately coming from 30-3. So 7mm, I think, is sort of the bottom end of the cartridges that saw a significant benefit from going to Spitzer. So it really split that difference. It's almost like it just barely avoided the problems of being a 6.5, and yet was still smaller diameter than, say, the 8s that were more standard, or the 7.6s that were more standard. And so for me, it seems like 7mm Mauser hugged the line in terms of being ready for Spitzer cartridges.
It'd be interesting because they already set up for long range. I'd like to see 9-hole reviews probably do like a test on that for the differences to see how they did.
That'd be a really good idea.
Right? I would love for because they're already set up for that almost 500 yards, or if not 500. Like I think they would do a very good job because watching with their math, they'd be excellent for that.
The problem is finding two rifles, one still cited for bottlenosed and one still cited for Spitzer.
And then you have to understand different conditions. Yeah.
That would be tricky.
Yeah.
But, and then again, also some of it's terminal performance. But I tend to feel very confident, and this is more feeling than hard math. I tend to feel very confident with a 7mm cartridge, and yet I get all those smaller diameter benefits. To me, I just like them a lot.
Fair.
And like you said, what led into this was you saying that the recoil is very nice on something like this.
Now, I assume the mass of the gun itself brought it down a little bit more than what I thought it would, but it was still, I had to go back and confirm that footage because I was like, I remember the recoil not being very much with this guy, and sure enough, no, it's barely up there.
No, but you've shot similar rifles like the Gewehr 98.
Yep.
And you've shot like the Arisaka Type 38. Which would you put this closer to in terms of perceived recoil?
I guess it's kind of somewhere in the middle. It's somewhere between the two. But if I had to pick one it was slightly closer to, probably the Arisaka. That's just because I think it might be like a shade closer to 6.5.
Right. And yet your performance is going to be a little bit closer to the 8mm side of things.
Yes, it would.
I don't know. I like it.
It's weird.
Yeah.
It's good, but it's weird.
I think it was a good decision. It was a short answer. For Spain and for a number of other countries that went with the same cartridge. I think it's an underrepresented cartridge. So, and the reason we're talking about it so much is because this gun we fired already in 7.65 Argentine or Belgian because of the Ottoman contract. So that's really the distinguishing difference between this and the other one other than the magazine cutoff. So I guess what you've sort of said to me is that by defining the mold, this gun becomes unremarkable. Yeah,
that's the thing, is that for the shoot itself, it just had such good performance that I didn't even think about everything. Like, it wasn't like, what I mean by it wasn't over the top phenomenal. Like, it wasn't like the pick all end all, like, amazing shoot that it had no recoil or the trigger was glass all the way through, perfect single stage of some sort. No, it wasn't like all that, but it just was so unremarkable that it did so well and I performed so well with it, and it just, everything landed on target and nothing bad happened, that it was a good shooter. It was a good, easy shoot for me.
The problem is most of the remarkable guns in our show are remarkable because they have weird things going on.
Right, like the Krags. It's like, this is a different magazine setup. I've never seen this. How am I going to do this?
Or you're playing with the shotgun and you're going, well, how much effective range do I really have?
Right.
This gun is a gun.
Stripper clip loaded, 5-round, Mauser style action, infantry rifle. A lot of these are just like ticking massive general boxes for a lot of the mass amount of guns that we've shot.
Do you remember anything about the video shoot that day when we were filming this gun?
I mean, I think I remember the lighting being annoying that day.
Yeah, you kind of remember the weather and the wet.
Yeah.
And you probably remember us trying to organize the ammo and get the equipment packed up. And I can think
And that
of...
was when David was still getting the range going for a fair bit.
Yep. I can remember a lot of details about that day, but not as many about this particular gun.
No, I even remember that was the day we shot the tie. I'm remembering the tie more than I'm remembering this one. And this one performed better.
Well, yeah, but why do you remember the tie?
Because it was giving me issues. And then I remember the Swiss, the Mannlicher, we were shooting that. And I remember having issues with that one because I just had the perfect timing for pulling the bolts out.
Right. We don't remember the Spanish very clearly because the Spanish did nothing remarkable. It shot straight. It shot reliably. Every round went bang. We were done with it in 10 minutes.
I think I technically shot this the least.
Right. Oh, no.
It performed. It was done. And I was like, oh, that's it.
Now, if you think of being an actual soldier, marching, camping, fighting is sort of... The fighting's the last little bit, right? It's always supposed to be long periods of hard work and boredom. And then brief periods of violence, right?
Yep.
This is what you want. Like,
oh, yeah.
And it makes for almost bad television because as a collector, you want the weird, you want the unusual, you want this thing that says, ooh, I'm a super weapon of some sort. No, you want bread and butter. You want it to be accurate and hard-hitting.
This is bread and butter, not even really toasted.
Yeah. I mean, did it shoot where you pointed it?
Yeah.
Was it 100% reliable? What else do you want?
That's pretty much it. That's what you want it to do.
That's not true. I can name 2 things you want.
Well, full auto might be better, I guess, technically.
Well, yeah, okay, but I'm talking about a bolt-action rifle.
Okay.
It's semi-pistol grip stock, I know you.
Yeah, and then if it was shorter, that would be nicer. Okay.
It's almost like we saw a 7mm Mauser 93 action.
What?
That was a carbine with a pistol grip. Where did we see that?
I don't know.
Oh.
Seriously, though. Serbian Mausers are actually pretty difficult to come across. I mean, we've only seen a few in the wild, and then we've only known a few other collectors that happen across them. They're pretty rare to come across.
They're extremely high dollar, irreplaceable items.
Right. Whereas, and that did great, so awesome, but hard to come by. Whereas the Spanish Mauser, they're like everywhere, and it performs so well, and they're cheap. That's actually pretty cool that you could probably have like something like this or something similar to it, and just for like practically nothing, even in the market that is currently today. Yeah, that's insane.
They're still very affordable. They're ubiquitous, and then also
decent cartridge.
We're going to talk about this next time. You can also get them in different chamberings because a lot of them were converted over to 7.62 NATO. So that's a more available cartridge. The short answer is this is one of the last bastions of enjoyable milsurp.
Did we just start shilling for old Spanish Mausers
you know,
now? We're not, no one's paying us to do this.
Yeah,
we
never get advertisers, right?
It's because we shill for Spanish Mausers. Who does that? Who would want us to do that?
It's not like we're working for Simpson or something and selling their high-end stuff, you know what I mean? Like, we're just ruining the market for the joy of ruining it.
Yeah.
I'm very sorry, everyone.
Sweet.
But I think this is an underappreciated gun, is the short answer.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I think that if you come across them and they're like they actually are in similar condition to this one, it just seems like an easy thing to grab where you can just have a good shooter for the day.
Right. Most people tend to think of Spanish Civil War, which we'll talk about next time. But let me assure you, we've already covered the Spanish-American War. Next time we're going to talk about some more minor conflicts. These things actually saw a lot of rotating use in more minor conflicts. They're a storied weapon, and they're one that we're still working on the story. So forgive me. This episode, I think we're fairly tight on the data, but getting into the next one, when we're going to talk about carbines, it gets really loose. And I'll even have a disclaimer at the beginning of the episode, but there's a lot of undiscovered territory in Spanish Mauser history. And that's just bizarre to me because major nation, major milsurp, it's everywhere. Plenty of people have been poking around at it, but primary sources are very limited.
We've had difficulty even acquiring sources for that particular episode. There's still a book that's floating out there that...
Would you like to have your rant?
Oh my God, it was in northern Spain, could not get them to ship outside of Spain, couldn't get them to ship it to another part of Spain. The same country.
Mae's a little mad that we missed out on one book that might have helped a little bit more with this episode.
It would have been nice, but dang if that didn't piss me off.
If you are a resident of Spain and you would like to be a point of contact for grabbing Spanish books, please let us know.
Yep, any part of Spain, because I've learned any and every part of Spain is going to benefit me.
Also hand traps. I need some hand traps out of Spain, but that's a separate show.
That's right, yeah.
So, Again, this may get a revisit because we don't know as much as we could possibly know about these guns.
And it would be cool if more information did surface.
Yeah, we're always welcome to hearing what you guys have unearthed on your own.
Yeah.
So, is there anything else that stands out about this gun?
Well, we didn't technically say if I'd take it into battle or not. I mean, after the whole review of everything, I guess maybe technically I might want to take it into battle.
Yeah, I was
just a
gonna
little
say.
bit. Yeah.
Is there any, seriously though, the only downside is the length and weight, right?
Yeah, that pretty much is it. And maybe, like I said, these sights are definitely for finer shooting. Just something a little bit deeper set for rapid acquisition would be nicer. That's about it. I could even go without the semi-pistol grip if I had to. If I could at least get a little bit of a deper sight set. For the
But there's nothing that puts us anywhere near the line for a no in World War I.
God, no. Yeah, no, this is a really good standard infantry rifle. I would happily take that into battle.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, like I said, we're going to talk more about the carbines and short rifles next time. So stick around for some more Spanish goodies. And then otherwise, stay tuned after the credits for any updates. And have a good one, everybody.
Bye.
Hey gang, for today's update, I'm going to provide a quick state of the show. Around the time of the Abity episode, we suddenly experienced a large and welcome growth in subscribers and new viewers. Seemingly in the middle of this wave, however, YouTube removed 10,000 subscribers with a warning note about bot accounts, and we've had a lot of notes from people discovering that they had been unsubscribed, including Mae's own personal account, which had permissions on the main account. In addition, we've actually slowly been losing support on Patreon. Nothing dire, but of course, we'd much rather see growth than to have it shrink. Remember, our goal is to find the best available information on small arms history and bring it to everyone in an easy-to-understand package, while also demonstrating the firearms themselves, and this can sometimes require some very deep dives into just making the ammo alone. You can support this mission for literally $1 a month, and if all of our regular viewers just chipped in that much, we'd be able to expand easily. So this is not a big ask for $5 or $10 or $20. To help things along, Mae and I have returned to a very aggressive no days off work schedule in an attempt to push more content for the show and to keep up with some of the more complicated episodes that we have in the pipeline. So please feel free to give us any support you can. Double check on Patreon, especially for our podcast where we read the mailbag from people that send things to our P.O. box. And if you have something to loan for the show that we have not covered, make sure you send that over to us over on our contact form. We make a lot of use of loaned firearms. We do not own them all. All right, thank you for watching and for your support.